What's up guys, Ancient here again with another build video, and today we are finally making the Werewolf build official. So this is the much hyped one button Werewolf build that was kind of played around with when Wolfhunter PTS first came out with all the buffs to the werewolves, and they haven't made a couple of nerfs in the PTS cycle. However, they didn't really nerf it all that much. So at the beginning of the Wolfhunter PTS, we were pulling maybe 53, 54k with Major Fracture, just light attacking. So no other abilities, just straight up light attacking. Then they changed one of our sets that we used, Blood Moon. So instead of giving 50% more light attack damage, it only gave 30% more light attack damage. So that dropped our DPS by a bit. However, you're still easily capable of pulling close to 50k with Major Fracture on this build using basically only light attacks. So this is basically a slight variation of that because obviously in a real dungeon or trial you would not simply just be light attacking. You need to obviously get healed and things like that, and you might want to provide some group utility as well. So this is going to basically go over your werewolf build for both 4-man content and 12-man trials. So we're going to go over gear, skills, CP points, and one thing I do want to point out here is that this build is centered around having an optimized raid group. So you do have Alkosh and you do have Infused Crusher, and you have good uptimes on both. So if you're not running Alkosh or anything like that, then your sets might change. We'll go over what you do in those certain situations. The other thing too is that we are also going to be assuming that this is going to be your primary form. That is, you're only going to be in human form until you get your werewolf ultimate up. And then at that point you use your werewolf ultimate and you stay in that werewolf form for as long as you can. So the idea behind here is that you basically want to stay in werewolf form as long as you can, because that's where most of your DPS is going to be coming from. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started here. First, we'll talk about gear. So because this is a light attack build, we're able to use a set that not a lot of people used to be quite popular back in PvP, but it has since kind of lost its claim to fame, and that's going to be Molag. So because we're only doing light attacks, we're able to use Overkill, which basically increases our weapon spell damage by, in this case, 516. But the trade-off is it also increases the cost of our abilities. Light attacks don't cost anything, so we're able to use very good use of Molag. We basically have 100% uptime or very good uptime on the Molag overload buff, overkill buff. So we have a very nice boost to our weapon damage using this set here. Now, if you don't have Molag, because you do need to get it from White Gold Tower, so you need Imperial City DLC in order to get it. You can just run your typical stam set, so something like Selene's, it's perfectly fine as well. Going to be a little bit less DPS, but it's still perfectly acceptable to have Selene's. Now, for our body set, we're still going with Relequen. Relequen is still by far the strongest stamina set in the game right now. So we have the perfect version here, but you can go with the imperfect version. The difference is going to be that 5-piece bonus, that max stamina bonus. The other 5-piece effect, the actual proc effect, that doesn't change at all between the perfect and imperfect version. So you can farm Cloud Rest on normal to get the armor pieces that you need to get the 5-piece Relequen's imperfect. So if you don't have access to Cloud Rest, you can swap this set out. You can swap it for something like Briarheart if you have access to Hrothgar in the Hircine DLC. You can go with Hunding's Rage if very easy to get, kind of a holdover set. And I believe, what's it called? Strengthening the Automaton is another good set that you might want to consider getting as well. That just because it increases all of our physical damage, and most of our damage here is going to be physical damage. I don't believe it affects your bleed, your werewolf bleed, but the werewolf bleed only is, if I'm remembering correctly from the common metrics parses, around 15, no more than about 18% of your DPS, so it's not that big of a deal. So those are kind of your main sets here. Relequen's obviously going to be the strongest one here. And then for our weapon piece, so as a werewolf, you aren't able to swap bars. So you can see here I can't weapon swap, so you're going to have to be on your front bar this whole time. So that's why we have our front bar ultimate is going to be a werewolf transformation. So we do have Blood Moon. So this comes from the new dungeon, Moonhunter Keep, I believe. No, the other one, March of Sacrifices. So when you deal critical damage with a melee light attack, you gain a stack of Blood Sun for 8 seconds. When you gain 5 stacks, you become frenzied for 5 seconds, increasing your melee light attack damage by 30% and attack speed by 50%. This effect can occur every 18 seconds. So you can see that this synergizes very well with werewolves and our light attacks. Our light attacks do a crap ton of damage, and having that 50% increased attack speed as well as 30% increased damage just really helps push our DPS even higher. So that's why we're running Blood Moon. So Blood Moon is a medium armor set, so if you want to, you can also run it on your armor pieces as well. So because we aren't bar swapping as a werewolf, either of these two sets can be on your body or your weapons. It all really depends on what you manage to get. So you can still do Hundings, you can still do Automaton, you can still do Briarheart. So you have a lot of different options here when it comes to sets that you can wear. You can also go with Ravager if you would like. Ravager, because it's a heavy armor set, you will need to go with jewelry and weapons if you are going the Ravager route. But that is one option that you might want to consider, especially if you are you still want to do very good DPS in your human form, because Ravager does have very good synergy with Relequen. But it's still a very good set to run as a werewolf because, again, you're not swapping bars, so you don't really need to worry about decreased uptime or anything like that. Now, you can run Twice Fang Snake as one of your two sets. If you are going to be running Twice Fang Snake, then you will not be running the Lover, you'll be running the Warrior as your Mundus Stone instead. The instance when you're going to be using Twice Fang Snake is going to be in situations where your group is not running Alkosh. If you're running Alkosh with the Lover and Twice Fang Snake, you're going to be overpenetrating, pretty much guaranteed. So between Major Fracture and Lover and Twice Fang Snake, you're already sitting at about 14,000, I should say, penetration. So with Alkosh and Infused Pressure, you're pushing way above the 18,200 penetration cap, so that's why you're going to be running the Warrior if you do decide to use Twice Fang Snake. So that is an option. I personally have tried both, and I found that running the Lover with Blood Moon is better than running the Warrior with Twice Fang Snake. So it is going to, if you use Twice Fang Snake on a dummy, it's going to be higher, but if you kind of correct for that a little bit, then you'll find that Twice Fang Snake actually isn't as good, at least in a trial scenario. And that's kind of what you want to shoot for. So Twice Fang Snake is always going to be better in dummy parts just because you have that additional penetration. So when you control for that, and then you do the math and get the ability metric, Twice Fang Snake does lose out to running something like Relequen with the Lover and Blood Moon. So that's just something to keep in mind. But if you don't have Alkosh, and then Twice Fang Snake does become an option in order to replace the loss of that debuff. Alright, so that's pretty much it for gear. So werewolves don't really have, there's not like a bunch of different options like there are with stamina DPS. You still have the same kind of sets you can run around with, but there's not much else to discuss. You are going with all medium, with all divines and all stamina enchants. That's because we are using blue food, because werewolves, again, light attack build, we don't need to worry about resources at all. And then for our jewelry traits, same kind of a deal here with the normal stamina DPS classes and DPS specs. Any combination between 3 Bloodthirsty and 3 Infused, or anywhere in between with 3 weapon damage enchants. Now, the one thing that is going to be varying a little bit here is going to be your weapons. So your main hand is still going to be nirn, except instead of a disease enchant, we're going with a poison enchant, because again, we can't swap bars, so we need to keep our poison enchant on our front bar here. And then our offhand, you have 2 options. You can go with Infused with a weapon damage enchant, or you can go with Precise, same thing, weapon damage enchant. Both of them pull very similar to each other. I would probably go for Infused with a weapon damage enchant personally, but Precise is also just a little bit weaker. It's maybe like 300 or 400 DPS weaker on a dummy, so it's kind of up to you which one you want to go for. Now I am using double daggers here. You can go with that Dagger Axe. Dagger Axe does pull higher on dummy tests, but having that extra dagger will scale a little bit better with Warhorn buffs. However, werewolves, because you're not getting minor force unless you have somebody using Stalwart Guard on you, you don't have as much critical damage. So the additional crit chance isn't as big of a modifier compared to that having that axe bleed available. So Dagger Axe won't scale as nicely with things like Major Force and Warhorn, but because you don't have as much critical damage because you're not running Rearmed Trap, Dagger also sees a lower increase in DPS, so they're both pretty comparable in terms of DPS. So you can go with either Double Dagger or Dagger Axe. Alright, now going over our character sheet, we are a Redguard. Even though Redguards are King of Sustain and we don't need the additional Sustain from Redguards, they, at least among the base 9 classes, they have the highest stamina, max stamina passive modifier, which is why we're going with Redguards. You could go with Khajiits as well, if you want to have additional crit chance, but you do lose that max stamina, so it's kind of up to you which one you want to do. Redguard is going to be a little bit better overall than what I did. Plus, as a human, you still get that additional sustain, so that's really nice to have here. Now, we are a Sorc. You can be any class at all, so this build is class agnostic. I'm just a Sorc because Sorcs do have additional passive with Implosion. So whenever you deal physical damage, basically it acts as a kind of passive execute under Stormcalling. It's called Implosion. When you deal physical damage, you have a chance to basically deal additional physical damage when the enemy is under 50% health. So this kind of acts as a kind of a passive execute. So that's why we're a Sorc. But like I said, you can go with any of the classes. So Sorc is going to be just a little bit stronger. Now for attribute points, all of our points are into stamina because we are using blue food. Again, we don't need to worry at all about sustain because we're just light attacking our hearts away. Now, you have 16k health, so that's a little bit on the low side. So if you do want to get a little bit more health, you can put some points into health, or you can run a health enchant on one of your small pieces. Kind of up to you. You can even go with like a heavy shoulder instead, or a heavy small piece. So it's kind of up to you if you want to get a little bit more health here. Werewolves do have just a little bit more resistances compared to your typical stamina DPS class. However, unlike your typical stamina DPS class, you don't have access to something like what's it called, Deadly Cloak, so you don't really have any additional mitigation. However, as a werewolf, you do have some nice heal over times, and a nice burst heal as well, so that's all built into your your skill bar, so having a little bit lower health isn't that big of a deal, too much as a werewolf as it would be if you were just a normal stamina DPS. For our Mundus, we're going with the Lover. Again, if you're running Twice Fang Snake, go with the Warrior instead, so you're not penetrating, unless you are not running Alkosh. In that case, you might want to consider running the Lover. Just try to get to 18,200 in terms of penetration between your debuffs and your buffs. So if you need to run the Lover with Twice Fang Snake because you don't have Alkosh or something like that, then that's what you got to do. For food, again, max health, max stam. Don't need to worry about sustain because we're just light attacking the whole time. Now for our skills, this is going to be very, very simple because as a werewolf, pretty only have access to your werewolf bar. So you only have your 5 active skills and you have your ultimate. And you can't use an ultimate because this is what you use to transform. Alright, so we just have all of our abilities here on our bar because there's no reason not to. We have 5 active abilities, we have 5 bar slots. Why not put them all in? Obviously, some of these are not going to be as useful in certain situations. So starting off here, actually let me go ahead and pick up a skill respec so you guys can see different morphs. So we're going with Pack Leader as our ultimate. So the other morph is called Werewolf Berserker, which increases the damage of our light attack bleed. So if you take a look at the bleed, it basically adds about 5,500 additional physical damage over the bleed duration. However, if you think about it, because we're light attacking the whole time, we're reapplying the bleed so often, we are getting bigger ticks, but overall it's not going to make that big of a difference. And the 2 dire wolves that are summoned actually do make contribute more DPS than the additional bleed damage does, just through their normal attacks and things like that. Now the danger with running Pack Leader is, as far as I'm aware, the dire wolves do count as pets for those mechanics like the Maja's Pillar mechanic and the Mage is Chain Lightning, so that's just something you want to keep in mind before you decide to go with this morph here. Now we're going with the Brutal Pounce instead of the other morph, which is Feral Pounce. It's kind of up to you which one you want to pick. So one of the weaknesses with the werewolf build is that you don't have a lot of splash damage. So at least with Brutal Pounce we have a little bit of AoE damage, but you can go with the other morph, which is Feral Pounce, to give yourself a little bit more duration to your werewolf transformation. Now it does have a 5-meter minimum range, so you need to back up and use it. So you're not really going to be using this too much on bosses. This is basically going to be kind of a gap closer for those situations where like you're fighting ads in dungeons maybe, or you have to do a mechanic, so you have to step away from the boss. That way you're able to jump right back into the fray, get right up into the boss's face, and start your DPS rotation again. Hircine's Fortitude is going to be our self-heal. So you could go with Hircine's Rage, but personally there's no reason to do so because it doesn't grant you, it used to grant a unique buff where it increased your weapon damage by 10%. Now it grants Major Brutality. So that's gained from potions, so you don't want to run Hircine's Rage. Instead, just go for Hircine's Fortitude to get a little bit more healing done, so you have 60% additional heal. Now for the next ability, Roar. So you have Ferocious Roar, which sets enemies off balance for 5 seconds. And you have Deafening Roar, which applies Major Fracture. Your tank's already applying Major Fracture, so you don't need Deafening Roar. So that's why we have Ferocious Roar. Plus, this is another method of setting enemies off balance. So that's always very nice to have a consistent source of off balance. Now, I think, I'm not 100% sure on this, but you might need to actually fear enemies in order to set them off balance. I'm not sure if you can't fear them like boss enemies, if you'll be able to set them off balance. Nonetheless, though, Ferocious Roar is probably the better morph just because Major Fracture is not great. It can be used as kind of an AoE sort of Major Fracture, trashables, but again, I believe you do need to fear them in order to apply Major Fracture. So I think it's kind of the same deal with Ferocious Roar. I'm not 100% certain on that though. Now for Piercing Howl, 2 morphs here. You have Howl of Agony and you have Howl of Despair. Now, for Howl of Agony, deals more damage to enemies that are feared. So in trials, bosses can't be feared, so it's pretty much a useless morph. However, Howl of Despair actually has a very nice synergy attached to it, and it's a unique synergy. So it's called the Feeding Frenzy synergy, which grants your ally unlimited uses of Empower for 5 seconds, which increases the damage done with light attacks by 40%. So you activate this, your allies activates Feeding Frenzy, and then their next about 4 or 5 light attacks are 40% stronger. So this is a very, very nice group utility buff here. So this is one that you do want to use from time to time in order to give your allies that empowered buff. And it's unlimited. It's not like you have one. You have unlimited empower for 5 seconds. And if you have 2 werewolves, you can just imagine trading back and forth this Feeding Frenzy synergy, how powerful that can be. Finally, Infectious Claws morph. You have Claws of Anguish, which afflicts enemies with Major Defile. So if you PvP a lot, you can choose this to get the Major Defile debuff. But if you don't PvP, if this is strictly for PvE, go with Claws of Life. It basically gives you a heal, 50% of the disease damage done. And because the disease damage you can see here is pretty strong, it's 17.5k. So you heal 50% of that. So that's what we have, Claws of Life. It's also a nice dot as well, so it just gives you a little bit of additional dot damage there. Right now for our CPs. So again, I do want to reiterate that this is focused in on using your werewolf form as long as possible. So our blue CPs are going to be very different from your typical stamina DPS. Starting off with our green CPs, we still have 75 Moon Cap and 75 Tenacity. That's just because in those instances where we are human, we still want to have a little bit of sustain. So we have that there. Leaves us 110 points, which you can put into remaining nodes really however you'd like. 40 Shadow Ward, 40 Tumbling. 30 Warlord is what I have, but you can split it up really however you'd like. Now for our blue CPs, this is going to be the biggest difference between your typical stamina DPS, mainly because we don't have a lot of dots going on, so we don't really need that many points in the Thaumaturge anymore. We don't have a very high crit damage, because we're not running Minor Force. We don't have really high crit chance, because we're not running Advanced Yokeda. Precise Strikes isn't quite as important. Now, if you are running Advanced Yokeda, that is a set that I forgot to mention. You can run Advanced Yokeda as well with this build. You might want to put a couple more points into Precise Strikes because now you have a higher crit chance, so you want to increase your crit modifier a little bit more, so Precise Strikes might be a little bit more important that way. But your big focus is going to be Physical Weapons Expert and Mastered Arms because your light attacks do a whole lot of damage, so you want to buff them as much as you can. So this is the configuration that Constellation spit out for me after I did a couple of parses. We have 59 to Physical Weapons Expert, so just as a reference, the max percentage you can get on this is 35%, so we're only 6% off the max. 66 into Master at Arms, because that also buffs our light attacks. 13 Thaumaturge, 48 Precise Strikes, 25 Piercing, 4 die into Mighty. So again, this is kind of focused in on having those debuffs up. So if you don't have Outclass, you don't have Infused Thorax Crusher, you don't have Infused Crusher, you have low up times, shift some points around into Piercing. You can probably take points out of Thaumaturge, honestly, and kind of drop that down to 0 if you absolutely need the extra points. I would try to avoid touching Precise Strikes and Mighty. The only other one that I would take points out of would be Master at Arms. I'd take 5 points out, drop it to 61%. 61 points and put the rest into Piercing. So you have 18 points between dropping Thaumaturge to 0 and Master at Arms down to 61 if you do need the extra points into Piercing. Finally, our red CPs. This particular configuration is not optimized around any single piece of content. So if you want to maximize your mitigation for a ret trial or VMA or VDSA, then you will need to shift points around. This particular configuration is more of a balanced approach, so you have good mitigation across all different pieces of content that you could possibly run. So we have 66 into Ironclad, 56 into Thick-Skinned, 64 into Hardy and Elemental Defender, and that leaves 10 points, which we'll put into Quick Recovery. So they did update Werewolf, so you can now actually res as a Werewolf. We get this for the Field Physician passive, so if you're a progression style guild, if you're running like casual vet trials or things like that, it's always nice to have that little bit of damage mitigation there, because you're a Werewolf, so you don't have Deadly Cloak, you don't have shields, because you don't have Magicka, so it is very nice to have that Field Physician passive. But if you don't want it, if you're a score running guild or something like that, then you can put those 10 points from Quick Recovery back into Thick-Skinned or wherever you need them in order to maximize your mitigation. Alright, so that's pretty much it for the build. Now we're going to talk about our rotation, if you want to even call it a rotation. So I said this is kind of a modification of the one-button Werewolf build, so we're not just going to be strictly light attacking anymore. You can do that. You could just literally just hit your left mouse button the entire time if you'd like, if you don't think you got carpal tunnel that way. However, we do still want to kind of give our allies buffs and things like that, so we will be using things like Howl to Spare and Claws of Life for the heal. If we need the additional heal, the burst heal, we might use Hircine Fortitude. If we need to jump back, we need a gap closer, we might use Brutal Pounce. But if you're just looking for pure single target DPS, Howl to Spare and Claws of Life are going to be the two abilities that you're going to be basically using besides your light attacks. So for this particular parse that I'm going to be doing, we'll be using both of these skills. So basically what you want to do is you want to make sure to try to keep Claws of Life up for as much as you can, so 10-second dots, just make sure you're using it every 10 seconds. And then Howl to Spare, you want to use this because it is a synergy that has a 20-second cooldown, so you do want to use it every other time you cast Claws of Life. So you do Howl to Spare, Claws of Life, you let Claws of Life run out, do Claws of Life again, don't use Howl to Spare, you let that Claws of Life run out, you do Howl to Spare, Claws of Life. So that's kind of what you do, because there is a 20-second cooldown of synergies. So since Claws of Life has a 10-second duration, we're going to be using that kind of as our kind of guide. Now, because we're using these two abilities, we actually will be pulling slightly less DPS than we could if we just ignored using abilities at all. So that's just something to keep in mind. We also don't have Major Fracture, so we will be doing kind of behind the scenes math to basically give you an idea of the amount of DPS we'll actually be able to pull with Major Fractures, so you guys have a comparable metric to things like Stam PKs and Stam Nightblades that do have Major Fracture. So it's something you just want to keep in mind. Now, one thing I will want to point out here is if you are using Blood Moon, when you have the Frenzied proc up, and Surrender does track it, so over here on the right hand side you will see Frenzied somewhere along here. When you have Frenzied up, you do not want to use any abilities. Light attacks are still your #1 source of DPS, so you just want to capitalize on that Frenzied buff. So if your Claws of Life runs out and your Frenzy still has 3 seconds on it, finish off the 3 seconds Frenzy, and then go back to the Claws of Life. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started with this part, so you guys get an idea of what Werewolf DPS are able to pull. So the lightning that's around us, that is from Molag. You can see Frenzy just showed up. It's out. now we're going to use Howl before we apply the next. Before we apply the next loss of life, just so that we're looking at our allies of synergy. Again, so we want fronting to run completely out before we apply the 12th flame. And Howl again. Again, that's just for the synergy. Not for personal DPS, that's just so that you're a team player. Keep an eye on that frenzies. Frenzy buff. Howling again before the next pulse of play. You can already see on our DPS tracker that we're doing quite a bit of DPS. Already doing a lot more than some other builds, like non-wolf builds. So. And we want to turn these one out before we apply a life. And we finish off this quest. So there we go. That is our parse. You can see here in the lower left hand screen, 48k, full of common metrics. You can see just how powerful the werewolf actually is. So again, this is without major fracture. You can see our physical penetration is basically our CP and the lover. So with major fracture, we'd be adding probably close to about 10% or so additional DPS, but anywhere between 9 and 10%. So if you think about it, 48k, where we add major fracture, we're adding in almost another 5k DPS. So we're still able to pull 52, 53k with major fracture. So yeah, it was a bit of a nerf because I believe the highest that I've seen before they nerfed Blood Moon was around 57, 58k with major fracture or something like that. So this is a very easy to use build. All you have to do is you just got to be able to count to 2 and just keep hitting your light attack button. There are some downsides, obviously, with running a werewolf build. So this is I kind of mentioned this earlier when we were talking about Pounce. This is purely single target DPS. If you have ads, if you need AOE damage, this build is not right. This build is absolute garbage. But if your goal is pure single target DPS with the most brain dead rotation there is, you can't even call it a rotation, then this is the build for you. So you can just real quick going through the common metrics parts here. This is all of our damage. So these two Nashes and the lunge, that is from our direwolves. So each Nash is one of the two direwolves, and then the lunge just counts both. I think both of them will do it here. So you can see that combined, your direwolves do a fair amount of DPS. They do over 10% of our DPS. But light attacks, oh boy, how much of our damage comes from light attacks? 45% of our damage comes from light attacks. The werewolf bleed here, pretty strong. And Relequen, oh poor Relequen. Relequen used to be at the top, and now it's no longer. Werewolf bleed beats it out, as do light attacks. So we do have our poison damage enchant is proccing here and there. Overall, not all too useful. It adds only about 1.5% DPS, which is still something. And you can see here Implosion procced 7 times that parse, and just adds a little bit more DPS here. And our weapon damage enchant uptime, about 86%. I've managed to get this up to over 90% before, so it's kind of a little bit of RNG involved here. But other than that, yeah, this build is very easy, very good DPS, great for PvE, and terrifying in PvP against people who don't know how to play against werewolves. The downside is, of course, you don't have any sort of cleave aside from Pounce. So this is just if you want pure single target DPS with a very brain dead rotation, this is the build for you. Alright, so that is it for this build video. If you guys have any questions about playing werewolves in a PvE environment, leave them down in the comment section below. I'll try to answer them. I do have a couple of friends who do have werewolves, this particular build actually, just for fun. We don't really use it in trials. It's more for format content. We can do like a 4 werewolf that DLC dungeons or something like that. So we don't really use this too much in trials, but you can certainly use this in trials if your rating will allow you to, of course. There's not many questions that we could think of about this build, but if you do manage to think of something, please drop them down in the comments and we'll try to answer them to the best of our ability. Hope you guys found this video informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.